Welcome to the TNF podcast. Like, comment, share, subscribe, and click on that bell for notifications. And if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, give us a follow and give us a rating. That would be fantastic. I also have a merchandising company, Hell's Heart Merch Company. Going over to hellsheartco.bigcartel.com. Use the code podcast for 20% off your entire order. They're fine Bella Canvas, next level tri-blend t-shirts. They feel amazing. If you like movies, if you like hardcore, we got movie themed and we've got hardcore themed t-shirts. The shirts are really soft. I think you'll enjoy them. So check it out. Follow us on Instagram too at HellsHeartCO. And I have a few things I want to promote. My friend John Cuccinello has a book called Come Inside and Meet My Punk Rock Family. It chronicles all the characters that he's met within the hardcore scene. As you can see here, we've got Mike Ness from Social Distortion, and he does this in a really awesome fashion. And it's got limited press. It's at revhq.com. 12% of the proceeds go to the St. Jude's Children's Hospital. So please check that out. Like I said, limited run. Get it while it's hot. Please support. And also, my friend Lou Collar has been undergoing his cancer treatment. He is really in need of help. I have a QR code for his GoFundMe. If you would please check it out and donate there, that would be amazing. He's a really awesome guy. His brother Pete is also selling some shirts on his Instagram. And pick one up, two up. One is $35, two for $50. They're limited edition Pete and Lou shirts. So check them out. All right, my next guest today. I've been communicating with this guy offline. He seems like a really awesome guy. He's got a really interesting life trajectory. I've listened to his episode on The Hardcore Therapist, and you should check that show out too. That's my friend Sarah Koretsky-Rossington. Go on over and follow that on Spotify and Instagram and all that. But really honored and privileged today to have the bassist of the bands DYS and Slapshot, Jonathan Anastas. Thank you much for being here. Thank you so much for being here, Jonathan.
Thank you for having me, and all my thoughts and prayers to Lou. He's a good dude. We've shared bills with them. He's a talented guy. He's a good guy. It's tough as we hardcore guys get older and face this stuff. So big ups to Lou.
Yeah. No, he's a really incredible guy, and he's really going through it. I've been communicating with Pete, and he seems to be in a good place right now. So I'd love to see him do a full recovery. Were you good friends with him growing up?
I wouldn't say good friends. We lived in different cities, but in any of our interactions, couldn't have been sweeter, couldn't have been nicer, couldn't have been more complimentary. They always put on great shows every time we played with them. I think the first time I met those guys, I was in Slapshot back in the day, and we just happened to bump into them on Lansdowne Street, and they just couldn't have been nicer guys. And probably the last time we shared a bill with them was probably around 2018 or so. But again, they've been nothing but sweethearts in the entire time I've known them. And again, like tight shows, great shows, a lot of energy, inspirational.
Yeah, that pretty much sums him up. And I really love Sick of It All, and like I said, I hope he has a full recovery. And I've got family members that have been through it. I've got friends that have been through it, and I know it's a real struggle. So yeah, anybody that's watching, listening, please help out. That would be greatly appreciated. So let's talk about you a little bit. My first question for you is, what is your relationship with music? Did you grow up listening to music in your household, and what was it? And what was like your first band? Did you have a high school band? And what was your, well, you've kind of discussed this with me, but like, what was your first non-metal and non-hardcore concert? And obviously, you kind of had a little bit of a, your introduction was through hardcore and punk rock, like going to live shows. So, what was your first hardcore and punk rock live show?
All right, that's a lot. We'll sort of work
I
backwards.
know. Well, we can go by the bullet points again if you need to.
I grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and on the North Shore of Boston, the child of like 1970s hippies. My dad originally was a jazz man. His uncle played professional music, so maybe that was my inspiration. My uncle played jazz with Woody Herman. He went on an Elvis tour. He played on a Diana Ross record. And this is when I'm a little kid. He lived a big life as a musician. I remember at some point I was really young. He had been living in Vegas for years and he sort of came back to Boston to teach at the Berklee College of Music and dry out basically, right? Like hard jazz man's life on the road, drugs, alcohol. And he came back to Boston to sort of pay it forward, teach music and clean up. That was probably my first musical memory. And so my dad always played jazz vinyl, had a pretty deep jazz collection. My mom had what you would sort of expect a 70s hippie mom to have. There was like Carole King, Joan Baez, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. There were Beatles records. I later found out there were Rolling Stones records, but I don't ever remember her playing them.
Hmm.
Most of that stuff didn't speak to me. I think weirdly, the record in her collection that spoke to me first was the soundtrack for The Harder They Come. And I just thought like that cover and like Peter Tosh was such a badass. And I know we just lost him, but like so much of reggae seemed like hippie and soft, right? And like Peter Tosh did not seem soft, right? Like a step and razor. So that spoke to me a lot as like a rebellious teen. And then that morphed into hard rock. You couldn't grow up in Boston and not want to be either Joe Perry or Steven Tyler. Like absolutely, like everybody I knew wanted to be one of them, if not both of them. And it's interesting because they were doing their last residency in Vegas, and I got to tell them that. I got to tell them how much they inspired my journey at the very beginning. And then it sort of morphed from Aerosmith through Kiss into like early punk rock. I went to the summer camp in Maine. Strangely, Henry Rollins he's older than I am, was at that summer camp pre-punk rock. Um, and that summer camp was primarily city kids from New York. And like I realized going to summer camp with city kids from New York that we kids in Boston knew nothing. And I was just introduced to all sorts of things through them, healthy things, unhealthy things. But I remember one year, these kids, teenagers, just started showing up at this summer camp in Maine with like punk rock records, and that piqued my interest. And it kind of took hold, and I went back to Boston, and it all just took off quickly after that.
So, wait. So, I want to ask you this question: like with the punk rock camp, or I'm sorry, the camp, like did you meet Henry Rollins? Did you know him there?
Oh yeah, I did. I did. But this was like pre SOA. This was just like, you know, regular rebellious teenager Henry Rollins. But yeah. Um Patrick Dempsey was actually there too. Those guys are a bit older than me, but Patrick
Oh wow.
Dempsey, but mostly the camp was defined by like the kind of kids like, if you knew the Beastie Boys, like they grew up in Manhattan and were just like way more sophisticated for their age than like we kids from Boston or like the rest of New England. And so they just, they were just engrossed in stuff, right? Like so they
Hmm.
just had these magazines first and had these records first.
And I noticed on Sarah's podcast, you said that you started playing the bass because you wanted to be like one of those like arena rock like 70s type musicians, but you didn't feel like you had the skill set to do it, and that punk rock and hardcore was kind of more accessible to you. And so what kind of motivated you to pick it up? Like, did you play any instruments before that, or was bass your first go round?
I took whatever music classes were in public school at the time. I remember drum lessons. I remember learning like paradiddles and flams and all that stuff. And, I probably took some violin lessons at school. It definitely wasn't flute. So I had some sense of strings, some baby sense of strings and tuning, though I couldn't tell you what a violin is tuned to. But, really self-taught for most of it. And I couldn't even tell you exactly why I picked up bass versus guitar, except, probably because Paul Simonon was the coolest guy in the Clash to me. Um, y- you know, Probably if he really put a gun to my head and said why bass, but definitely like started wanting to be like Aerosmith, and the thought of like trying to figure out how to play those songs without a music teacher or anything was above my pay grade. And pretty quickly you could figure out how to play along with a Ramones record.
So from there, like, where did you go as far as like what was the formation of DYS? Did you have any proto bands prior to that point, or was that your first band?
So I did have a proto band, and both the wonderful and terrible thing about punk rock and hardcore is there are no gatekeepers. And there's a great thing about there are no gatekeepers, which is like there all the barriers between you and the things you want are gone. But in hindsight, there's some downsides to those barriers being gone, which is like you've got this stuff out in the world probably before it was ready to be out in the world. So actually, my proto band was this band called Decadence, which was high school classmates of mine, and we did that song "Slam" on the Boston Not LA soundtrack. Um, Ironically, I believe that was the song on that record that got the biggest sync. If you remember, there's a promo, Santa's Secret Life as a Slam Dancer, that ran on MTV for 10 years, if not maybe 15 or 20, but it's an animated Santa sort of painted on top of like a mosh pit. And it's the chorus of that song. I'm going to slam, I'm going to slam, I'm going to slam, I'm going to slam. So it was, like probably the first hardcore band to get an MTV sync. So that was my proto band.
Okay. And then kind of lead me through the formation of DYS. Was that like, you know, were some of the members in that band end up going to DYS?
Originally, that was a plan, but it never happened. So after the Decadence thing, I had after school job at Newbury Comics, which for people who grew up in Boston knew that Newbury Comics wasn't. I mean, they sold comic books, but really it was a place where everybody got their records. And I had a high school guidance counselor. I was rebellious. I was struggling in school. If I loved something, I got an A. If I didn't love something, I didn't go to it. And he was just figuring out how to keep me engaged, and found me this internship that turned into a paid job at Newbury Comics where I could be around music and things that I love. And I put a index card up on the bulletin board in Newbury Comics, like bass player and guitar player looking for singer and drummer for band. And we probably had hardcore and punk influences on there. And Dave Smalley had just moved to Boston to go to Boston College. And that's how we connected through that. And he said he had a drummer, and his drummer was terrible. And my guitar player wanted to actually have nothing to really do with punk rock after that and play something much more mainstream. So very, very quickly, it was Dave Smalley and I as the unit. We stayed for many years, and then we've continued to wrap ourselves around different formations of musicians to make whatever we're making at the time and play whatever we're playing at the time. So this little index card on the bulletin board of Newbury Comics is what connected Dave Smalley and I when sort of I was getting into the Boston punk rock world, and he was just coming to Boston from DC.
It's incredible. Like it's weird because we're so connected now. Like you can just reach out to somebody in a different portion of the world and say, I want to start a project like, you know, Cro-Mags or Bad Brains or something like that. But you really had to go from like a real analog perspective, like, and it was just so much more simpler at that time.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because I've heard the origin story of SSD that they actually ran a print ad in the Boston Phoenix, which was like the alternative newspaper in Boston. And for us, it was like a little printed, 5x7 index card. But probably if you were interested in punk rock in Boston, you came through Newbury Comics at some point. But yes, it's very funny how we all got connected then. And then everything meant more. I'm stealing this from other interviews, but if somebody was wearing it was in the day where I feel like you saw the Black Flag bars on somebody or the Misfits Fiend skull, like it meant something. And you would like go out of your way to talk to that person, right? Like a complete stranger. Like now, well, the Ramones is probably one of the top merched bands, right? For people that have like never seen the Ramones. And I see Black Flag bars on rappers, right? I see exploited, spiked jackets on hip hop stars. But then, like, if you saw a sighting of a Black Flag shirt on the bus, on the subway, on the street, you'd be like, hey, are you into Black Flag? Like, it was like a thing.
Right. You were able to recognize other misfits just
Yeah.
based on, like, you were like Black Flag, you're literally like flying
Yeah.
a punk rock flag.
Yes.
So you're like, oh, that guy's into some cool stuff, I'm gonna go and talk to
Yeah.
him and possibly make a friend. Yeah, definitely.
And you were so desperate for people who were into what you were into, right? You were desperate for those people. Or even like in Boston, unlike LA, like I'm sure in LA, like all kinds of straight people carried skateboards around, right? Like in Boston, if you were carrying a skateboard around, it was like likely that you were into punk rock or something. Like, so even if you saw a kid with like, like a Dwayne Peters board or like a Stacy Peralta board, like you were like, hey, you.
That was an instant connection right there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. And with Newbury Comics, I've always heard of the venue, and you said it was probably more of a music venue, like a a space versus an actual comic store.
Well, it started as an actual comic store, and then they started carrying alternative records. And then it became clear they could make more money selling these alternative records than they could comic books, though they never got rid of comic books. And at some point, they split the original Newbury Comics into two, and comic books were in one storefront and records were in another. And then they started a record label, right? They started Modern Method Records, and then they started Boston Rock Magazine. Like the two guys, Mike and John, who started it, ended up being very entrepreneurial. I think they met at MIT. And this was their post MIT business, believe it or not. Like, could you consider something less MIT and like more analog than like we're selling comic books? But the cool thing was, working there, I got first crack at something. And you think about then, like singles would come in like three, you'd get three minor threat singles or five minor threat singles. That's it, right? And I'd get one on day one.
So, were you ever a comic guy though? Was that something that you grew up with?
Again, I think comics goes with that stuff. Like I wasn't a collector. I was a reader. Dave
Yeah.
Smalley was much more of a comic collector. I read comics, and believe me, when I could read a lot of comics for a discount or free, I read a lot of comics. But it's just all these sort of alternative, like these worlds. If you think about like comics of like R. Crumb or like associated with like the Bay Area hippie movement, like these things all go together. Oh, also, it's funny because I just ran into her for the first time in years in LA. Amy Mann from Till Tuesday also worked at Newbury Comics at that time. I just ran into her at a wedding here in LA, and we were sharing some old Newbury Comics moments.
Oh, Crumb. That's interesting that you brought him up. He was such a weird guy. He wasn't really connected to punk rock at all, was he?
No, but he was connected to that 60s Timothy Leary, right? Like counterculture. I'm just saying that I think comics have spent a lot of time around counterculture. And
Sure,
then
sure,
ultimately
definitely.
spawned alternative, independent comics and all that stuff. And if you think about, where we've all copped key art and all that stuff, when we were all too punk rock to care about intellectual property law, right? Like how many logos were stolen from comic books.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That documentary about him is really good too. I was a big fan of that. I'd never seen it before,
Mm.
but he was, and I've always kind of thought that like people that were kind of in those scenes were kind of the laid the groundwork and were like the purveyors of what eventually became punk rock, even like surf rock bands or,
Yeah.
um, you know, uh, God, what's that song? Um, the one from Full Metal Jacket, the like that guy, the bird is the word. That song,
Right.
like that. That's like proto punk. Like, and I think
Yeah.
that there were a lot of those guys that really kind of, were just very influential on that whole scene.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now back to DYS. So, how were you guys received in the Boston scene, and what about the Boston music scene do you feel like is unique to the rest of the country? And what do you think about it is better? What do you think about it is maybe not so good as other places in the country or in the world?
Again, that's a lot to unpack. So I'm
Okay.
probably not the best person to be, uh, completely unemotional or fair about how DYS was received. Looking back, we were probably viewed as like SSD's baby brothers, right? And maybe like hewing very close to their path, right? Like, they do Kids Will Have Their Say, and then we do Brotherhood, which is sort of similar in tempo and in, sort of subject matter. And then, they get a second guitarist and slow down, and we get a second guitarist and slow down. So, I would probably say there was a perception of that. We were definitely all part of the Boston crew. I definitely would say that we were like, you learn how to skiing in front of somebody that's better than you, right? They were a half a step ahead of us at least. And so there was a path. You could see a path, like if you didn't know how to do anything. And, Al Baril was, when I look back at it, not just so driven. I think so many people have talked about how driven he is, figuring out how to get this stuff done, but so generous with the stuff that he learned, right? Like Ian kind of taught him how to put out records, and then he taught all of us how to put out records. He kind of like if he learned how to do something, he would share it, right? Like here's the basic P&L of doing like a VFW show, or like I remember all these funny little things. Like Ian Mackay taught him to print twice as many sleeves as records because you got a better price break. And then also sleeves took longer. So if you sold out of the first pressing, you'd have the sleeves. And that stuck with him. And then he taught all of us when we were putting out records, right? If you're putting out 2,000 records, print 4,000 sleeves or 5,000 sleeves. Like there could have been a sense of competitiveness where he shared none of that, right? Like I want to stay ahead of you guys, so like I'm sharing nothing, and he shared all of it. And I think that's one of the things that made Boston different and special was like we were cohesive, we were together, we were a crew, like they said, like SSD said, like crew like glue. And also, I think different than a bunch of scenes, like we were primarily suburban kids, and some of us were athletes in a traditional sense, and some of us were athletes in an untraditional sense, like skateboarders, but sort of like dedicated to bettering themselves, right? Like I'm gonna skate this half pipe 30 times if I fall every time, right? Or I'm gonna keep skating until I'm good, right? Like so there was a work ethic to Boston hardcore that I didn't necessarily see mirrored in every scene. And then you take those kids and you take the distraction of drugs and alcohol away from a bunch of them. And then that even focuses you more, right? Because all the things that make you soft are gone, or all the things that can distract you are gone, or many of them are gone. So you have this cohesiveness, you've got this work ethic, and then you take away these like destructive, distractive substances, and you're like full on. And I think like everything in the world where like your strengths and your weaknesses come together, I would say people would say the Boston hardcore scene was full on for all the good that brought with that and all the bad that came with that.
Do you feel like there was anything that, like with North Carolina, I know that one of the disadvantages was there wasn't a lot of interconnectivity because we were all so spread apart. And as a result of that, it was very like loyal to one area. Like,
Hmm.
Charlotte was Charlotte, Winston Salem was Winston Salem, Raleigh was Raleigh, and like sometimes people could be a little bit petty, like they wouldn't know a person and there'd be like kind of this like rivalry or something like that. Sometimes like people would warm up to each other. Sometimes people would kind of like, mix. And I think, the more technology kind of brought us together, that kind of dissipated. But like, what do you feel like, I guess you could say Boston could maybe learn from, could maybe like improve upon in their scene?
Well, I mean, to your point, I think we were very insular. I think we were tough to outsiders. I think we were tough to perceived outsiders. I remember when Husker Du came to sing, well, they came to town to play a show, and Lou Giordano, our engineer, ended up really doing a lot of work with them. And so we brought them down to the studio and sort of they ended up singing back up on our record, but they were just drilling us with questions. I hear that if they see a beer in your hand, somebody slaps it out of it in Boston. Or if you have long hair, like they pin you down and shave your head. And like we had that reputation, and it's funny because we didn't do it, it wasn't as true as people thought, but we didn't really do anything to dissuade the rumors.
Gotcha. And, with DYS, like, what kind of were your influences? Like, what were you really kind of feeling on as far as, you know, whether it be hardcore, non hardcore, punk rock? Like, what really kind of helped to shape your sound, you feel?
Well, as you said earlier, and I think it's so important to what happened with music then, we were not all interconnected, right? So it was hard to be influenced by things that you didn't either physically see or physically own, right? Like there was radio, but there was no national radio. The closest thing to national radio was MTV, and MTV was not playing punk rock even, let alone hardcore. You could get new wave, you could get In Excess, you could get Duran Duran, right? But like until Headbangers Ball, and even then they weren't really playing hardcore. The Cro-Mags got played a couple of times, right? But they were playing Guns N' Roses, they were playing Poison. So, we were probably too influenced by what we heard or saw, right? Which meant for DYS, first it's like SSD. What do the FUs sound like? What are Jerry's Kids doing? What does Black Flag sound like? What does DOA sound like? What do the Bad Brains sound like that nobody could ever reach their highs? And then when things started to change, it was because Metallica came to town, like Venom came to town. I talk about how, like, literally the air changed in Boston after the first Metallica show, which is like, if you think about when Black Flag first came to Boston and played the Paradise, everybody formed a band that sounded like Black Flag after that. And Metallica came and played the Rat and probably had like 9 Marshall cabinets inside the Rat, and it was one of those weird shows where probably 50% of the audience were in bands, and all these one guitar bands got a second guitar, and like all these Boston punk bands that were playing out of like Fender Twins and like PBs all of a sudden bought Marshalls, and now all of our songs had 6 parts and 5 tempos, and because we were that blown away by it.
That was kind of a big thing back in the 80s. I mean, I didn't grow up in that generation, but I've listened to a lot of the records where, a lot of the bands were doing the whole crossover thrash thing. And then a lot is to mixed results and stuff. And I understand that DYS kind of went in that direction for a while. What did you kind of feel about that? Was that an organic thing, or was it more of like um this is what we want to sound like?
Well, it was what we wanted to sound like, but it was organic. Like you couldn't call it a cash grab because there was no money in that kind of metal then. Like, we look back now and Metallica's, the biggest rock band in the world. But when we first met those guys, they weren't living any better than we were. They weren't making any more money than we were. Now that changed pretty quickly. But like, Metallica talks about paying, eating hand sandwich on tour, right? Which is you could afford the luncheon meat, but you couldn't afford the bread, right? Like their van was no nicer than our van. They had a little bit more equipment because they wanted to, but like it was a very
Right.
intentional sonic direction, but that wasn't for a check, right? Because at that point you couldn't see that the check there was bigger, right? It was interesting. I think at that time, when Suicidal rolled through town, they seemed to be making more money than Metallica, right? If you go back to that point, but it was very intentional. I think and it was also to where you were earlier. It was going back to what we probably wanted to do the first time, but didn't know how to do it. Like literally didn't know how to do it, right? And then you've played 50 shows, and you've seen some other shows, and spending 90 minutes 5 feet away from Cliff Burton, watching every finger move. Like we figured out how to do it.
Favorite Metallica record?
Yeah. Well, not as good as a Metallica record, but we tried to write a
No,
Metallica record.
I said favorite Metallica
Oh,
record. What do you got?
for me, it's got to be Kill 'Em All because that was the record that inspired
Yeah,
us. The Black Album was the album that broke them. Um, but can't beat Hit the Lights.
yeah.
We
Well,
used to
and
we used to sound check Hit the Lights used to be our sound check for a long time in the later phase of that band, and it used to bum out the punk rockers in the room who were there.
that's funny. Yeah, bumming out punk rockers. I remember since we were on the topic of Black Flag earlier, I remember from Get in the Van, they would say that they would go and play not as like a sound check, but they would play through the PA. They would play ZZ Top's Eliminator to piss off all the punk rockers, and I'm like, man, that's hilarious, you know?
Their very existence by the end pissed off punk rockers. I understand how Henry ended up where he ended up because, like, literally, if you went to those late shows, right, with Kira and Bill Stevenson, and Henry's like in shorts and nothing else, like, people would be burning him with cigarettes, like, just punching him. They were like that angry, right? That they were like slow and dirgy and the songs were 6 minutes. And like, Henry had to fight every one of those crowds for his life, basically, at the end. And so,
Yeah.
we sort of had that attitude. I remember like our record release show for our second record, right? And we come on stage, we're playing our set, we're like tossing free copies out in the audience. People are like throwing them back, like, I don't want that piece of shit. So we're playing like a ballad.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I'm with you on Ride the Lightning too, in that it's almost punk rock. It's very raw. It's very aggressive, and yeah, they kind of broke after the Black album. Like they just really weren't the same. I don't. I guess they did that Death Magnetic. I don't know if you ever heard that one.
Here's what I don't understand. What I don't understand is somewhere along the line, they're the only band I know that consistently regressed from a production standpoint. Like the sounds on the record just got worse, and I don't understand why, right? Because they could have like the best producers in the business, and they did, but those records just got sonically worse, like
Mm.
in a shocking way that I really can't understand.
Yeah, like Saint Anger. I remember the
Yeah,
guys and gals in Martyr AD showed me that album, and I was like, it sounds like a fucking trash can. The fucking
yes,
snare sounds like they are banging on a fucking trash can lid.
yes, sadly.
Yeah, it's disappointing, but yeah, I those first few early Metallica records, incredible. I love it. And again, back to DYS. What was your run like, and where did you guys tour, and what was sort of the dissolution of the band, and subsequently you guys reformed later on, but what was that whole trajectory like?
Yeah, and I'd love to spend some time talking about the Reformation because I actually think it's a weird, rare outlying story. I mean, it's actually not dissimilar in the Sex Pistols. So the original run was short. The original run was probably no more than 3 years, right? So sort of like there's like 9 months of trying to figure out how to be a band, like 9 months or a year touring to the degree that you could behind a hardcore record, and then 9 months or a year trying to figure out how to be a crossover band or whatever you want to call it, and then we're done. The end is like, I think we just got ahead of our skis in terms of like 17, 18, and the stakes are getting bigger and the shows are getting bigger. And now because crossover is starting to happen, we're doing like showcases for major labels in front of like A&R people who signed bands like Metallica. And we're about to make like a multi-camera music video and something falls through with the van and we can't make it to like Toronto or Vancouver or wherever. It wasn't Vancouver, but like Toronto or Montreal or wherever we're supposed to play the show, where we've set up this 4 camera shoot. And that was like the straw that just sort of broke it. But like at some point, we just couldn't figure out how to get to the next level, right? No management, no real experience. And also, like, for whatever reason, there's like we couldn't write anymore. Like, we sort of agreed up to that second record. And then there was like a part of the band that wanted to go, like, all right, let's take one step more towards the mainstream. Like, you think about like where 7 Seconds went. Like 7 Seconds went like even poppier, right? They didn't go metal. And in our final live show, I've heard a cassette, and there's like 2 songs we never recorded. That's a whole more step towards, like, I guess what they were calling college rock, or like, it's not even heavy like crossover anymore. So we were splintered on sort of where to take it sonically. So there's that combination of just like literally not knowing how to do the next steps, and then sort of not being in agreement in a unit anymore. And, there's the whole Slapshot chapter we can talk about. But I think the amazing thing that I never thought would happen is, so I have this 3 years and I think it's going to be it forever, right? I go off and build a business career. And then we have a chance to go do it again. And the second run was 15 years. I mean, of not constant playing, but like 15 years. We took a band that like was played 3 years, was on the shelf for a decade or more, and then like came back for 15, played bigger shows, more shows. And the only other band that I really know that was like that was the Sex Pistols, right? Where if you count the number of shows they played before they broke up, you could probably count them on your fingers and toes.
Like nothing.
And then, and I got to know Steve Jones a little bit in Los Angeles, and then to watch them do the 96 World Tour and the 2001 World Tour. And, now before Jonesy broke his wrist, they're flying private around the world, like playing festivals. They're literally, and I'm not even intimating that we're on the same level of the Sex Pistols, but they're really the only other band that I know necessarily, because like Agnostic Front and Madball are like bigger than ever, but I sort of feel like they never stopped, right? I sort of feel like Suicidal never stopped. So there's these bands who have gone on and just the train rolled, right? Like Metallica. But I just feel incredibly fortunate that I got this second bite with some added maturity, some added understanding about how to make music. I got to surround myself with, better players, better producers, better record label, better promoters, and we got to play most of the European hardcore festivals that mattered, a lot of the American hardcore festivals that mattered, a lot of shows, and I'm super fortunate for that and super grateful for it.
So you said you started a business career in the like the time period between DYS and Slapshot?
No, I was in college in the time period. There was very little time between DYS and Slapshot. I missed it too much. So DYS breaks up. I'm working whatever kind of crappy jobs you work, when you're a musician that you can stomach because you're a musician, right? Your identity is musician. And then when the band is over, your identity is whatever crappy job you have. Your identity is line cook or record store clerk or whatever. And then you look at the next 30 years of that and you say, like, is that really what I want to do?
Right.
And I went back to my parents, who I completely said this about college to, and that was the ultimate act of rebellion. My mom's got a PhD, my dad's got 2 master's degrees. There was no way I could hurt their feelings more than saying no college. Like, literally, it was the most rebellious thing I could do. It's the most hurtful thing I could do. And I remember going back and being like, hey, that college thing. And they were super pragmatic about it. They said, we're going to lend you money for the first semester. I think it was like, if you get a 3.5 or better, it's a gift. If you get a 3.0 or better, it's a loan, and the loans keep coming. If you get under a 3.0, and I got like a 3.85, and I just started taking more classes and more classes, more classes. And I got this chance to do Slapshot, and I did the first record, Back on the Map, and did a bunch of shows with them. And then I moved across the state to finish college in Amherst. And between being across the state and now being like in residential college full time, I just couldn't do both things. And then I went on
Oh,
to this career in advertising and marketing after that.
so we'll get to that. Yeah, let's talk about the genesis of Slapshot a little bit. So you were still hungry to kind of play music, and then you started that band, and what was kind of the trajectory from there? Like, what were you guys? How were you guys received in the Boston scene again and around the world? I guess probably pretty well because you were pretty well established with DYS.
That's giving me way too much credit. So the interesting thing about Slapshot is I did not form Slapshot. I was the last person hired. Mark, Choke, and Steve founded Slapshot. And they probably had half the set written by the time we started talking about doing it. So I get no credit for anything. I get no credit for the name. The band probably already had 8 or 10 songs written. I wrote Killing Frost, the music. Jack wrote the lyrics. No, I might have even written the lyrics. I take that back. I wrote Killing Frost, the words and the lyrics. I wrote the main riff. I wrote like one main riff. Everything else, I think, was pretty much Jack. So,
And
and it was interesting because I deeply missed being in a band. I deeply missed being on stage. I remember right after SSD broke up, I'm at a show and Springer from SSD comes up to me and he just looks at me and he goes, "Man, the second you step off the stage, they forget who you are." And then he just goes wandering off into the night. And it's true, and I miss that. And
yeah.
there was something really freeing about it not being my band. Like it was Jack's band. And we played the songs the way Jack wanted to play them, and we played the shows Jack wanted to play. And there was something kind of freeing in that after feeling like I was carrying this thing that I wasn't really like. Dave and I carried DYS and have always carried DYS as sort of equal partners. And there was something super freeing about just showing up and playing, right? Like super freeing. And I don't think anybody came to see me. Jack hadn't been in, Jack had negative effects before that, right? So I think if anything, people were showing up to see him. And it was like the choke show in a way. And I mean that in a great way where I could just be the bass player. Um, and he formed the whole image, and it was almost like around the idea of being like a WWF heel, right? Like it was like an act. Right. And like we had those like, there were those varsity jackets and we just show up at other people's shows and like turn our backs to the band. So like the band on stage would just see like Slapshot Boston, Slapshot Boston, Slapshot Boston, Slapshot Boston, and just stand like this with our backs to the band for the whole set, right? To establish ourselves like before that, like, like the like almost like a version of cutting a promo, like
Sure.
before the wrestler is introduced. Like I want to say there was like 3 or 4 shows we went and did that before we'd ever played a show.
But were they privy to this?
No,
They were not. Okay.
they were not.
Because a lot of the theatrics of the
Of
WWF, now
course.
the WWE, like they're all in on it. So, but that's great. I've
N-
never heard of anybody doing that before. That's funny.
No, nobody was in on any of it. Believe me, Choke used to like hit us with his hockey stick on stage. We were not in on any of that. You'd be like, bro, like we actually can't play the show if you break my hand.
That's fantastic. That's wonderful. With being in both bands, what do you think was the biggest challenge? You had mentioned going to your the conflict with going to college with your parents and stuff like that versus wanting to be a punk rock musician. What do you think are some challenges that your bands and other bands kind of deal with?
I mean, I think it's just it's the logistics of like how do you keep the lights on in your life and chase your passion, right? Because very rarely can you make money, especially off the bat, doing the thing that you love, right? So how much are you willing to sacrifice for it? And I think that's part of like why this works for the young, right? Because I think there are 40-year-olds out there who are still sacrificing, but it's hard to like be 40 and like sleep on the floor, sleep in the van, and like I was very
Yeah.
lucky when I was doing it at 40. I was on paid corporate vacation when we went to Europe. You know what I mean? Like literally,
Ah.
absolutely literally, right?
Oh wow.
And I'd be upgrading my hotels out of my pocket, right? Because I'd be like,
Oh
we'd get. I know I sound like a prima donna, but I'd get somewhere and I'd be like,
no.
I'd get somewhere and be like, ah, I'm not staying here tonight. Like, um, it's funny. I won't name his name, but there is a very famous person who's still playing in a very famous punk rock band, and the story is their first tour, American tour, was financed off their dad's corporate platinum Amex. But we'll leave that person unnamed, like when they were
Got it.
19. But
Wow.
but so I would say the hardest thing is that, like, that commitment to your art and your craft. Well, you have to eat, well, you have to have a roof over your head, well, you're going to school where you work 5 jobs, whatever it is that you do, and like keeping the flame alive is like the hard thing, right?
Right.
And even like before, like, so we're DYS, it'd be like play New York, load out at 2:30 in the morning, get back to Boston at 5, got to be at Newbury Comics at 9 for like store opening at 10, right? And at Slapshot it would be like, well, I have homework. And there's no, and it's like, well, does the homework get done when we're on a weekend tour, right? Like I got to finish the 8-page paper. And you remember how big like a word processor was then, right? I wasn't writing papers on my phone. Um, so that stuff was hard.
Mhm. And kind of
Because
back.
again, sorry, again, because when I did it
Go ahead.
later, technology's on my side. When DYS toured in 2018, I toured with an office basically, right? I got 2 laptops, 2 phones,
Right.
MiFi.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. Technology has definitely kind of made it advantageous. You can work remotely, and I know who was it that was on this show? Oh, it was Aaron from Bain, is like able to do design work
Yeah,
remotely,
totally.
virtually, because and that's so amazing. And it's like I wish I had that job. I wish I had a job that like kind of
Yep.
allowed me to do that. But it is what it is. And kind of back to Metallica, like you had mentioned, being like 40 and sleeping on the floor and stuff like that. Those guys really grinded when they first started. Those
Yeah.
guys were living in the same house. I don't think I could do that at 20. I don't think I could do that at 30. Like would end up, somebody would get hurt. Somebody would,
Yeah.
like, and it might be me, so it would be really just not conducive to being like mentally healthy or anything like that. And but they did it, and like, is there ever a part of you that kind of wanted to do more and felt like you could have sacrificed more to just be like a full-time touring musician?
If you, if I hadn't gotten a second bite, I think I'd have a lot of regrets. And my advice to younger people now is I probably gave up too soon the first time around. I probably got too worried. I mean, it's funny. I didn't care about my future at all, right? And then I probably all of a sudden cared about my future too much. But because I got this second bite at it, I don't have that regret, right? But if I hadn't, I'm sure I would. But if you'd asked me at 30, were you ever going to play on stage again? I would have told you no way. I would have told you that nobody wanted to see it. I would have told you that nobody was going to show up. And I would have told you that it was never possible. So that's the other thing. So if the first lesson is like live your grind and figure it out, the second lesson is that like you don't know what's going to happen, right?
Right.
Like these things that you are sure are never going to happen can happen.
Yeah. 100%. 100%. Um, well, with your career, you mentioned that you describe your career again, because it was very like multifaceted and multi-pronged. So kind of describe what line of work you're in and what you do. And you actually have a really interesting geographical journey as well. So talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So the easiest way to describe my career is I've done business in where I would say culture, content, and commerce come together, right? Because culture, music has always been super important to me. So that has meant advertising and marketing. That's meant video games, sports, entertainment. And that's meant sort of crafting assets of which you're leveraging culture, right? You're leveraging music. Like I've used a ton of bands that I've loved in syncs and discovered bands that I've used in syncs. And so, I was an account executive in an ad agency. I got promoted. I was, a marketing executive in video game companies like Atari and Activision. I went and launched a music startup and took it public. I went to gaming, sports, entertainment. That's where I live. I'm currently I'm a startup CEO and on a couple of boards of earlier stage companies. And but it is always where these passions come together, right? Where like culture, content, and commerce come together. Where like music, sports, entertainment, where that crosses over, right? Because those are like the deep loves of my life, like these subcultures. And geographically, it weirdly gave me a rock star life. Like in that time where I wasn't playing, I've flown 2.5 million miles on one airline in my life. Now I had other flights on other airlines, but like I can go on a computer and it shows me that I flew 2.5 million miles. There's probably very significant touring bands that have not flown 2.5 million miles, right? Um, I lived in New York a couple times. I lived in LA a couple times. I lived in the Bay Area. I lived in Singapore on and off pre-pandemic and during the pandemic. I'm back in LA now. But a lot of my life was like get off a plane, go to a meeting, make a presentation, go have a business dinner, and then fly on to the next city, which isn't that different than fly to a city, do a sound check, do a radio interview or a meet and greet, fly to the next city. Like it's weirdly not that different.
Mm. Singapore, what was that like? Did they have? I would assume they have a hardcore scene.
I didn't find it. I wasn't looking for it, so I don't want to offend a Singaporean hardcore scene. I'm sure it's there. I'm more familiar with like the Japanese hardcore scene and like the Malaysian hardcore scene and the Philippines hardcore scene. I'm sure there's one in
Nice.
Singapore. I was just focused on like doing business, but Singapore is like, I don't want to offend Singaporeans because it's a beautiful country. I would call it a combination of like Hong Kong and Las Vegas, meaning it is an island in Southeast Asia that has become the hub for global business, especially after the mainland Chinese took Hong Kong back over, but it's younger than Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a much, much older country. Singapore is only 50, 60 years old as a country. So it's newer. And it feels like Las Vegas, where there's malls, like luxury malls, the same hoteliers who build in Las Vegas. Like I'm sure you've seen the famous thing like Crazy Rich Asians, like the boat on top of the hotel, like that Sheldon
Right.
Adelson who built a piece of Las Vegas. So it feels like Hong Kong with like an added layer of luxury malls. It's a very
Mm.
wealthy country, but it has become the Southeast Asian hub for a lot of global multinational companies right now. Like a lot of global businesses centered in Singapore. They've got a big startup scene. They support business. I worked for a company called One Championship, which is in the MMA business. And we were the Singaporean sovereign fund invested in the company. Singaporean tourism was one of our sponsors. Like they are very good to their business ecosystem. The country was very good to me. The housing stock is expensive but amazing. The people are so nice. The food is great. Everybody's a hard worker. People are very well educated. I was a green card holder for 3 years. Like I literally held a green card in Singapore, and it was an amazing opportunity.
Very clean country too, as well, right?
So clean, so well run. They brag about how you could leave your laptop on a table in Starbucks and come back 8 hours later and it's still there.
Oh, that's nice.
One day I was staying at a hotel. It was the pandemic, and so hotels had a hard time because Singapore's basically sealed off. I was living in a very nice five-star hotel in Singapore. It sounds crazy, but it was the pandemic, so it was so cheap. I was living at the Shangri-La, which is one of the finest hotels in the world, and I leave my wallet in the cup on the elliptical machine or the Stairmaster or whatever at the gym, and I finish my workout and it's probably Saturday and I'm wandering up to my room and I stop at the cafe to get like a smoothie or whatever. And by the time I get back to my room, my wallet is already back on the desk in my hotel room.
Wow. Good, noble, virtuous people then.
Virtuous, educated, hardworking, nice, beautiful.
Wow. Yeah. Oh, that sounds like that. Sounds like the United States could use some of that. You have said that you work with video games as well, and there was a really cool assessment that you had made on Sarah's show in that video games get a lot of mileage for the money, which I have played video games and I've had to kind of put some limits on myself because of the amount of time that I put into
Yes.
video games. But, you know, what do you feel like? Do you feel like video games now are kind of almost like they draw you in because of that. They try to get more mileage out of that to kind of get you hooked.
Well, let's start with video games as an industry are larger than television, movies, and music combined globally. So let's start with that. And then you move into, let's leave the ad supported platforms like Instagram and Facebook out of it. There is probably no entertainment slash media business that gives the consumer more content for their dollar than a $70 video game, right? Than like a Grand Theft Auto or a Call of Duty or a Battlefield, you know, like to your point, like hundreds of hours, thousands of hours. Um, Video games are sort of at a tipping point, which is like that world that I grew up in video games. I was very fortunate when like the premium, console video game drove the American market, and we could sell $1 billion worth of stuff in 7 days, like literally, like we could get to a billion faster than any movie
Mm.
is now under pressure, right? There's all these free to play games and mobile games. And so the consumer is rethinking the value proposition. Like I used to think you get a lot for $60, now $70 in a video game. And now people are saying, well, look what I get with Candy Crush for free, right? Or look what I get with Minecraft for free. Like that's not $60. And in fact, I can earn on those games. I can earn like not only am I not
Yeah.
paying you, you're paying me, right?
Yeah.
And so I think video games is in like a big rethink right now, but it's still the largest entertainment sector on earth, you know? Like so what was Netflix next move? Video games. They're like, we can't add another $900 million in market cap to this company with more TV content, right? That's not going to add another 900 billion dollars in market cap. So we're going to video games, right? Because as Ted famously said, Netflix doesn't compete with other TV, they compete with sleep, right? All of our entertainment choices now compete with sleep, right?
Yeah.
Like, I got my phone, I got my laptop, I've got my music, I've got my streaming, you got my video games, you're just competing with sleep.
Yeah, that is a very, very accurate analysis of that. There's so many times where I'm just like, oh, I've got the Criterion channel. Oh man, look at it's all of Ingmar Bergman's catalog.
Yep,
Well, I could dive into that. Right now, I'm watching all of John Woo's Hong Kong films, and I'm just
yep,
like, man, this is great. It's all at my command, and yeah, with the video games, 320 hours out of an $80 game, Legend of Zelda:
yep,
Tears of the Kingdom. Totally worth it. Totally
yep,
worth it.
yep, totally.
It's just it's crazy. And yeah, like at Netflix, I forgot they were doing the actual video games. I guess they do that on streaming or something like that. But yeah, competing with sleep. That's a really accurate analysis. You live in LA at present. What do you like about LA? What's some of your kind of hobbies while you're there? I know you're a big gym enthusiast. What else do you like to do while you're there? What's some of your favorite spots?
So here's what I would say about LA. I can't tell you why, but this city spoke to me from the first moment I was here. And it's hard to place my finger on it. I mean, part of it is like I grew up in New England where you are who you were, you are who your parents were, you are who your grandparents were. And in LA, it's too young. In LA, did you ever watch Mad Men?
I heard this analogy, but go ahead and tell it for the show.
So, like when Don Draper gets found out as being not Don Draper, right? You know, and the head of the ad agency turns to the guys trying to out him and goes, A man is who he is in the room. And you should be more concerned with bringing in more clients and less concerned with Mr. Draper. And LA is a man or a woman is who they are in the room, right? Boston is the only place where 40-year-olds will tell you where they went to college for undergrad, right? Like
Really?
nobody in LA tells you where they went to undergrad at 40, right? Um, and in LA, you are who your dad was or your grandfather, right? New England isn't named by accident. And in LA, like it was freeing, like you just were who you were, right? And I think there's actually a great democracy in that. People call it shallow. I think it's like this the ultimate expression of American democracy that you just are who you are in the room. I mean, I remember having a dinner with Will Smith and his son Jaden when they were launching their water brand, and Will said, they don't see black and white in Hollywood, they just see green.
Mm,
So his view was like, if I'm earning, I'm in the room, right? To go back to the in the room
right.
analogy. And so I like that freedom in LA and that reinvention, and people come here to make it, and then there's an ugly side, right? That spits a lot of people out and it brings a lot of charlatans and hucksters and people who take advantage of people who want to come here and remake themselves. And that
There's
tension,
a lot of that.
that tension of sunshine and noir, right, is part of what I love about LA. Like I've gone to all those great art shows like Sunshine and Noir, and like like all right, so it's all summed up. So I remember my first trip to LA where I was staying here, and a friend of mine from Boston who ended up engaged to a very famous TV star was out here, and I was kind enough to stay with her. She was kind enough to let me stay with her, and I'm at the pool. They bought Tarzan's old house, Johnny Weissmuller's old house.
Oh, wow.
And so I'm by the pool at Tarzan's house, 1920s Spanish, and I'm flipping through a magazine or whatever. And I hear this rustling. It's like, afternoon. I hear this rustling in the ivy in the hillside here. Plop. And a big giant rat lands on the hardscape by the pool. And I was like, oh my God, Christine, there's a rat. And she's like, every day there's a rat. The hills, the hills in LA are infested with rats, right?
Really?
And it's like this sunshine and noir of like LA, like those film noir movies, like
Yeah.
in the prep we were talking about like the pimp's house from LA Confidential, like kind of looms
Right.
over his home, that actual house looms over my house right now, right? And it's a little bit evil, like in how it looks. And I loved that darkness and light that's always inhabited LA. And I've been drawn to that stuff. Like the places that have been constants in my life in LA are like the Chateau Marmont, Musso and Frank's, Dan Tana's, the Sunset Tower, which is that dining room used to be John Wayne's apartment. Like,
Wow.
I mean, it's part of why I live in part of LA I live in, right? Because it's surrounded with like I'm surrounded by old Hollywood, and
Yeah.
that sort of darkness and light. And you could picture, one of those old film noir movies happening at any house in my neighborhood because they were all shot here.
Oh, yeah. Well, God, I have been watching movies before at my apartment or my house, and I notice I'm like, wait, this is right around the corner,
Yeah.
and it's kind of surreal.
I remember my old house at the top of our street. There was this really nice 20 Spanish house. And I said to my wife, I was like, that's the front doorway from Double Indemnity with like Barbara Stanwyck. And I took a
Yeah.
picture of my phone and I went back and pulled up the movie and it absolutely was.
Wow. That is wild. It's surreal. It's crazy.
Yeah. So that's part of what I love about LA and the creativity that's here, right? Like, this is a city. Like, there's a lot of creativity in New York, and there's always been a lot of art in New York, like especially high art and music. But like New York is ultimately a money city, right? Like New York is ultimately a city that finance runs, and everything else is like the supporting cast,
Right.
right? Like LA is a city that creativity runs and everything else is a supporting cast, and it's having its struggles right now. But even music, which used to be New York based, basically moved to LA. Like I don't live that far away from Nate Albert from the Mighty Mighty Bosstones, who followed his musical dreams out here post Bosstones, right? He runs a record label. He used to do it in New York. Now he does it in LA.
Wow. That's crazy. Yeah, I really appreciate what you say about the sunshine in noir too, and I'm a big film noir fan, and I definitely got to go to a lot of the landmarks. I guess you could call this film a noir, but Body Double, Brian De
Yeah.
Palma. Yeah,
Oh my God. That's the Lautner Chemisphere house.
Chemisphere. Yeah, yeah. I
Benedict
was. I
Toshin.
Go
Benedict
ahead.
Toshin bought that house. Toshin Publishing.
That's right.
And before he got divorced, I think his wife got the house in the divorce. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure his wife got. So when Benedict still had that house, I'd go to book parties there at Chemisphere.
Really.
Yeah.
What? That's crazy because I would go around and take pictures, and I wanted to go up there, and like you couldn't even get within like a 1,000 foot radius of it. Like it was
No.
a no trespassing that far, you know?
Yes. Yeah. It's on Torreyson Drive, and there's another great Lautner next door. Um, that's a great house. That was that to the point about it being a creative city. There's another Lautner next door that was built for a radio star of the time, like a big radio announcer. The Nesbitt House.
Okay. Did you? You know, I went looking for the Sunset Boulevard house, but it's not apparently at the address. I
I
guess
don't
maybe they
know if
had it
that
at a
house is
different
still
spot.
there.
Okay.
I won't speak to that house because I don't want to get it wrong.
Okay.
Um,
William Holden gives an address in the movie, and I was like, I'm going there. I'm going, you
yeah,
know, and
yeah,
I went there, and I think I read somewhere later that they said that it wasn't there or something, like they actually filmed it somewhere else.
that would make a lot of sense. I mean, it's funny because I tried to see the Tate House, but it had been torn down, and the La Bianca house is in my neighborhood.
Oh, wow.
And it's funny because I had this vintage car mechanic and I was trying to pick up one of my vintage cars from him. And he's like, "Oh, my mom lives in your neighborhood. I'll just drive the car to my mom's house and you just get your wife to come over and drop me off and get it at my mom's house." And I get out and he's at the street with my car, just less than a mile from my house. And I look at him and I go, "Bro, do you live next door to the La Bianca house?" And he's an older guy and he's like, "Yeah, I was 8 when it happened."
Oh, wow.
He's
So
like,
he
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 lived there.
remembers it.
He remembers it from 1969. He was born in 1961 or whatever, right? And like,
Wow. That's got to be a crazy thing to experience as a young kid. You mentioned the Tate House. It's funny because I remember we were talking about Once Upon a Time in
yep,
Hollywood, and I was like, I'm gonna go over to LCLO Drive and just see what's
yep,
going on there, you know. And I played Nine Inch Nails, The Downward Spiral, because that
yep,
was recorded in that house, which they later condemned and tore
yep,
down. And I remember just driving up there, and I'm sure that happened a lot around the time that movie was
yep.
premiered. People just shaking their heads, and I was just like, "Oh man, like was that in bad taste? I don't know. Like I really wanted to see."
I think I've read interviews where Trent regrets recording in that house.
Really?
I think I've read interviews because I think the sister was very upset by it.
Oh,
And again, I'm not sure if that's the complete reason, but I'm pretty sure I've read Reznor interviews where he sort of deeply regrets. I don't know if it was the recording there or making a thing of recording there, like basically making it a marketing beat. You know, he may have just regretted the marketing around it. But
yeah.
uh but yeah.
Yeah. Well, I've been told that he said that there was some like bad energy there, and that's something actually you said your wife remarked upon the L.A. Confidential house, the where the Black Dahlia supposedly met her end at.
Yeah,
And
that's the Sowden house. Yes, the Lloyd
okay,
Wright Sowden on Franklin. I didn't tell her that before we went in, and we went into the Sowden house. It was for sale at the time. And we leave and I go, what'd you think? I was in love with the house. I couldn't afford it, but I was in love with it. So I was like, you know, it's a part of me wants to be like, I'm going to sell every single thing in my house, every single thing I own to try to get this Sowden house. And she's like, I hate it. The energy is terrible. And That's when I told her that people think that's the house that the Black Dahlia was dismembered in.
Oh wow. She just sensed that immediately.
Yeah. Hmm.
Wow.
And
That's crazy.
supposedly, even if Black Dahlia wasn't dismembered there, a bunch of other dark things happened in that house. The doctor that owned that house, to go back to LA Confidential, sort of real life, was the guy you would go to if you were like an LA cop and you got a venereal disease from a prostitute, or you knocked up your girlfriend and you needed an illegal abortion. Like, that is where
Oh
you would
wow.
go. And he supposedly had orgies with Man Ray there. So even if Black Dahlia was not in fact dismembered there, a bunch of dark
There
stuff
was some
happened at the south.
still some weird stuff going around. Yeah, back to Sharon Tate. I ate at the El Coyote, and then was hit across the at the intersection across the street there. Like,
Dude,
not long after that. Yeah, I was like,
dude.
my buddy was telling me, he was like, yeah, this is where Sharon Tate and Teresa Folger and all the friends, the Polish crew, like had their last meal, and I was like, oh, that's cool. Went and saw a movie, left the theater, crack, got hit by a car. And I was like, I
Wow.
wonder if that's some sort of like centralized area of bad energy.
It might be, dude. It might be. That's a crazy story.
Yeah. It was again surreal. Just I was like, I can't. I didn't even put two and two together as far as that was concerned. And with your wife, you actually have an interesting story of how you met her. Like, you went on a like that was like the first date you went back to in L.A. and that was like that's how you found. That's incredible. I think that's amazing.
Thank you. That is absolutely true. And it's funny when you talk about like all these darkness and light. So it was the great financial crisis, and I had a big corporate job in New York. I was making the most money I'd ever made in my life. And I get fired, right? It's the great financial crisis. Fired. And I had bought an apartment in New York, in Chelsea, in like a restored old department store, 14-foot ceilings. And I'd rented my house in LA. And I swear, within like 2 days of getting fired, I get a phone call from my tenant in LA, and he got fired. And I'm like, I'm gonna end up homeless. Like, I don't know what I'm gonna do. And I decided that I was gonna sell my New York house because my network was better in LA and I had a better chance of getting another job in LA. And more of my friends were in LA, and I just needed to kind of retrench. And so I sold my New York house. I took a loss, but it could have been a lot worse. And I told my guy in LA, hey, dude, I know you had a hard time. I'm in escrow on my New York apartment. Let's make a deal. This is the day escrow closes. I'm flying home that day. Be gone. Have all your stuff out. Don't wreck my house. We'll call it even. Whatever you owe me, not going to chase you for, not going to sue you for. Just be gone and be kind to my house. And he lived up to his
Mhm.
part of the word. And I came back to my little house in LA, and, I got no job, and I got to fill my time. And I actually sort of enjoyed dating, and I'm like looking around for like, dates. And we have a mutual friend, and we sort of connected over that mutual friend, and had our first date in what is now the Soho House. And yeah, and then that was it. Last first date.
That's again, that's one of those like surreal stories, and that's almost like a Hollywood story.
And it like what should be a low in my life, right? Like, to give her credit, like she could have been like, who is this unemployed dude? Like, covered with tattoos.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good way of looking at it. Not having a job in LA is not good for the dating scene. It always seems like people are looking to ascend up the social ladder, and I I was on several dating apps at the time, and the women would say nobody that's an actor, a musician, none of that, and I was like, ugh, that's like 95% of the city.
Well, here's the sad thing about how I learned that the hard way before I came to LA, which probably made me smarter in LA. So being in bands, I very quickly learned, if you were like, say, the middle band, you could probably steal girlfriends from the opening band. And there was a very good chance that the headliner were going to steal girlfriends from you. Like, sadly, I learned that to be factually true
Oh, that's
very
awful.
early. And
That's kind
that
of shitty,
lesson,
though.
but it's true. It's shitty, but it's true. And that lesson followed me to LA and ended up very much being true again. I remember at some point I was dating this actress and we're in line for a movie, and she had done an episode of the Ben Stiller show, and Ben shows up. And she and Ben had this conversation of where I didn't exist for about 15 minutes while we're in the line for a
Oh God.
movie. And I remember dropping her off after that date and being like, Ben Stiller just stole my girlfriend. And I was right.
Whoa.
And he was living in George Raff's old apartment in that like building on Rossmore, like that famous apartment building.
Right.
Right. So he's living like this rakish single life. And, I'm like, what a brag stat. I would have loved to say to somebody, I live in George Raff's old apartment. Would you like to come over?
Oh man. Did she have any sort of conversation with you subsequently, or it was just like that was all she wrote? She just
Oh,
left.
I can't remember. I'm sure there was some, she didn't completely ghost me, I'm sure, but
Right. Right. Wow. That was the thing being on dating apps. You're competing with actors, athletes, musicians, all of that. And so it's like when you don't have any sort of uh, thing to really truly show for yourself, it just seems like, true love there doesn't exist, and that it's all on a superficial level. But it sounds like you got somebody that doesn't, uh, go for those sort of things.
I'm very lucky. My wife is far more, what's the word I'm looking for? She's far more evolved than I am. She's always been far more evolved than I am and far more spiritual. And I've tried to learn that stuff from her. But
Yeah.
and try to evolve along, and being a parent has increasingly, driven me to evolve and be a better person.
What's the biggest challenge of being a parent?
The biggest challenge of being a parent goes back to what we were talking about with music, right? So like before, all I had to worry about was work, right? And like if I could put 60 hours a week into work, 70 hours a week into work, which I routinely did, it would work out fine, right? I get promoted, we'd sell a lot of stuff, our business goals would be met, and I could be selfish, right? Like I could sleep when I wanted to sleep, I could eat when I wanted to eat, and I'd just work. Sounds sad, but I kind of liked it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then being married, I had to try to balance, fulfilling the emotional needs of somebody else and being conscious of them, but still having to fulfill like a work job. That was doable. And being a parent, all of a sudden, I had a really hard time balancing how am I getting work done? How am I being a good husband? How am I being a good parent? How am I being a good friend? How am I staying in shape and keeping my health up? How am I getting sleep? And lived and continue to live in this perpetual state of like, I'm failing at some of those things all the time. And I just have these panics. I'd be like, I had some hard times where I'd just be with my wife, like, if I don't find 8 hours a weekend to work, I am behind. And that just becomes compounding, right? And
Right.
I was, and in a month I'm going to be fired, or in 2 months I'm going to be fired, or in 3 months I'm going to be fired, right? But I've got to be present for this kid and got to be present for my wife and still need to see my friends and still need to like keep up on my health and my sleep and all that stuff. And I'm far from finding the perfect balance of that, but that's been the hardest thing, right? That back to like, how do you go to band practice and get to the job you need to get to and pay rent? It's always some version of like, how do you keep all the plates spinning
Right.
without just feeling like, because I just found at some point, life is always about some things in your life are a two and some things in your life are a 10. And I was just like wandering through life where like nothing is a 10 and feels like everything's a two. I'm failing at everything. Right. And it was sort of working through that emotionally.
Yeah. I was having a discussion with somebody the other day, and I frequently lose things and misplace things. And it's been to the point where it's embarrassing. Like I lost something or I forgot something and I had to go back to my apartment 6 different times, and my roommates were all in the living room, and we're all just like laughing at me. And I was like, oh, God, this sucks, you know? And I was like, you know, it's probably a good thing I'm not a parent. I was like, I don't know if I could, you know, oh, I'm going to go get some groceries. Oh, you
Yep.
know, kids in the car, you know, something like
Yep.
that. No, that's a little extreme, but you know, it sounds like you have really carved out a great life for yourself, and that you're um you know, a great husband and a great family man. I think that that's awesome. What is one piece of advice that you would give to your younger self?
A little bit of what we talked about before, which is like not to give up and to give it everything until you can't give it everything anymore. You know, like I'm a big believer, it's become cliche, the Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours, right? And you need your 10,000 hours to be able to convert when the opportunity comes. And a bit of that opportunity is also based on luck, right? So if you think about it in some ways, like my lucky point for DYS happened the second time around, not the first time around. We didn't hit a luck point the first time around, but I'd done my 10,000 hours when the point got there. And I'm a huge fan of Rick Rubin's. I got to know Rick when he was producing the Beastie Boys and that stuff, and I'd lost touch with Rick, and his podcast about creativity and touchstone has become a touchstone for me. And he is often reminding people of that, which is like these songs, if you do songwriting, for example, these songs come from God or wherever they come from, whatever your version of God is, right? They appear, but they don't just appear. Sometimes they just appear, but sometimes you have to do 75 takes until God appears, right? And Rick's always talking about how, you know, they say, well, there are how many takes? He's like, until it's done. And sometimes until it's done is a long time.
Mm,
Sometimes until it's done is you get out of the shower, you hum it into your phone and it's done. And sometimes when it's done is take 105.
yeah.
And so the advice that I would give is like to put yourself in a place where you can accept the gift, but you have to put in the work. And you have to be like, I'm not one of these people that believes that like drugs and alcohol release the gift. I think drugs and alcohol dull the gift. You know, like
Yeah.
if you meet, like, I think when you're 20, you can beat up your body enough and the gift still appears. And so you think it freed the gift, but it really just didn't punish the gift to death. But I'm old enough and seen enough that like you don't find very many 50-year-old, 55-year-old creatives who are alive, relevant, and not sober, right? That like you're either dead, you're irrelevant, or you're probably sober.
Yeah. I'm 3 years sober today as well. So
Congrats, dude.
thank you so much. And I feel like I have had a lot more creative focus as a result of that. And you're absolutely right. It's the party scene is not like an old timers club at all. And what you were saying, like as far as like the perfecting things, it's like you know, George Lucas with Star Wars. He's constantly adding to Star Wars and Empire
Yep.
Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. He made some statement along those lines, like art is never finished, it's evolving, or something like that. I don't
Yeah.
think that's verbatim. Also, like the artist that did Tubular Bells, I can't think of his name. He's just always
Yeah. Yeah.
adding to it, layering it, doing different things with it. He's like, it's never going to be done. It's almost like this
Yeah.
like obsession, you know?
And I would say it's not even chasing perfection, it's like chasing the magic moment. Because sometimes the magic moment is deeply imperfect, right? Like I've learned as I've learned more about music and worked with better producers and stuff that like technically the take that's perfect is like they're actually out of tune a little, but somehow it works, right? Or like somebody's off pitch a little, but somehow it's better than when they're not on off pitch, right? But like
Right.
you got to work until the magic appears.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Since we were talking about noir earlier, like I said, noir is one of my favorite genres. I'm a big fan, big fan. What are some movies of past, movies, music, art literature of past that really kind of influenced you that you appreciate? And what are some of the ones at present, movies, literature, arts, music that you appreciate? Four things.
Wow. Wow. I'm always terrible at these. I would say, some of my favorite movies are where like LA is a character. Like I can't watch Heat enough times. I
Oh,
can't watch To Live
amazing.
and Die. I can't watch To Live in LA, To Live and Die in LA enough times.
Yes.
Right? Like I can't watch Chinatown enough times. All that stuff where LA is like a character and there's all this darkness and light going on. uh, you know, the second season of True Detective, that was sort of like based in like Commerce, California, was like weird but great. So I'm definitely into stuff like that right now. From a television perspective, I'm obsessed with Landman, the Taylor
Yeah.
Sheridan show with Billy Bob. I love that. Before that, the one that sort of hit the biggest for me was Secession. Um, I'm embarrassed that I'm not really reading any books right now. And in terms of music, I'm all over the map. I'm like trying to go back and fill in gaps. Like I was too much of like a punk rock purist for a while, and I stupidly dismissed things that I shouldn't have dismissed. And I went back and I did a deep journey into like American country. I did a deep journey into like early 70s Rolling Stones, which I dismissed because when I saw the Stones for the first time, it was like in the 80s when they were dialing it in for money, and I don't think they were special. And then I've
Right.
subsequently seen the Stones, in like the aughts where they are special, and you go, oh, I get where that magic is from.
Right.
Oasis reunion was, I'm very picky, and Oasis was probably the best arena show I've ever seen in my life. Like they talk about twos and tens, they were tens on everything, like sonically, visuals, performances. They looked good, right? You don't want to close your eyes because the boys look like they're 150, right? Like I was blown away by just the totality of the Oasis show.
Hmm.
Um, you know, that's kind of like where I am these days. It's interesting because the XY axis of my taste and my wife's taste is OG country, right? Because I come wired like heavy rock and roll. She comes wired sort of singer songwriter. And where that crosses over is like Waylon, Johnny, Chris. Then you can
Yeah.
expand it into like, Steve Earle. Those places where country's as real as punk, right? That's where we
Absolutely. I was about to
that
say that. Yes.
that's where we found our common ground, and we're lucky enough to live near the Greek. And so anytime any one of those acts is at the Greek, we're there. I also became weirdly obsessed with trying to figure out Orville Peck for a while, right? Because here's a guy who comes out of like touring punk and has like created this character. And if these threads here have been like the WWE and like, because I grew up, in the shadow of the McMahons in New England, right? This idea of he's created a character with a mask, and it's like you can feel his punk roots in this sort of crooner stuff that's as much Dolly Parton as it is punk rock.
Yeah, and great. You totally nailed it with the country musicians that were almost again going to that like proto punk thing. Like Jerry Reed's pretty punk. Like,
Yeah.
you listen to his old catalog and they were all saying fuck you to Nashville
Yeah.
and much like the early punk and hardcore bands were kind of doing with the mainstream.
I just did a session for something that's coming out in a couple weeks with the drummer of 25 years from Dwight Yoakam. And that guy, when you hear it, he hits as hard as any rock drummer you'll ever hear.
Wow. Wow. What do you have in the works? What sort of projects? What are some things that you want to promote?
Well, so musically, I'm going to drop something in a couple of weeks. I don't want to say much more than that. Unfortunately, we had to put the pin in some DYS shows because Dave Smalley had cancer, which he's recovered from. We almost lost him a couple of years ago, but he's better. So we'd like to do some things around that, and the first sort of beat against that is going to come out in a couple of weeks.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to be sure to promote anything that you're doing here in the comments section and on Instagram and anything like that. I always like to make sure that all the guest endeavors get out there and people can follow you and appreciate what you're doing and support you. And I encourage anybody that listens to this show to please do that with all of the other artists. And like I had mentioned at the top of the show, like, comment, share, subscribe, click on that bell for notifications. And if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, give us a follow, give us a rating. You're so awesome. And all the things that I promoted at the top of the hour, Lou Collar, the GoFundMe, as you can see there, there's the SKU up there in the corner, the QR code. You're not buying anything, you're donating. And then, as I mentioned, Punk Rock Family, boom, John Cuccinello, Johnny Miami, OS 101, Hogan's Heroes. Pick one of those up for a great cause, St. Jude's Children's Hospital. And everybody, you guys have been so amazing. Namaste, jobless, be good. Thanks so much, Jonathan. I appreciate you.
Thanks for having me, dude.
Hell's Horn, lights again, money, power, the price of fame.